I'm a scientist, and so I fundamentally feel like, you probably, if you have the ability to look at the science and see where we're headed, then ask yourself, is this an environment that I would want to bring my children into? Because the questions that we ask ourselves are, what does my monthly budget look like? Or my child, might be interested in pursuing drama or this sport, and how do I plan my life around that schedule, et cetera. But I think that, what I see a lot of people saying, what a lot of scientists saying is, will there be enough food to eat?
I'm Kelty McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. I am extra excited today because we are kicking off season 2 of the podcast, and I have a killer lineup of guests for you in store for this upcoming season. Now, our very first guest who you're going to be hearing from today is somebody that I was actually connected with via my guest from Season 1, Episode 3. That's Leslie Schrock, who wrote the books Bumpin' and Fertility Rules. Now, after our conversation, I got an email from Leslie, and she said, I would love to connect you with the medical editor of my books, Jane Van Dis. I think she would be a great guest for the podcast. And I said, yes, please connect us. Jane and I teed up a time to chat, and she just has so much to share that is going to blow your mind, specifically on the topics of women's and maternal health and the intersection of that with climate crisis. I know that environmental changes that we are seeing and the state of our world is a really big question and concern on a lot of your minds. And so she's going to shed some light on what we need to know, what's going on, how this is affecting you and your health. You're in store for lots of good stuff today. But first, a little bit about Jane. So Jane Van Dis, MD, is an assistant professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Rochester and faculty in the Institute for Human Health and the Environment. She lectures nationally and internationally on the intersection of the climate crisis and women's and maternal health. She has co-founded OB-GYNs for Sustainability and Time's Up Healthcare and co-admins OB Mum Group. Dr. Van Dis is an editor at the Journal of OB Hospitalist Medicine and is a single mom to twins. Thank you for joining us today post-call, Jane. So glad that you're here today. I can only imagine, I think my brain would be fried after a 15-hour shift, but I know you're going to have lots of good things to share. And I just want to give a shout out to Leslie Schrock, who was our episode 3 guest, because she introduced the two of us. And I'd actually love for you to start just by telling what's the relationship with you and Leslie, specifically where her books are concerned.
Yeah. So Leslie and I met at Maven headquarters, I believe back in 2018. I was medical director at Maven from 2018 to 2021. And Leslie was friends with Kate Ryder and an early investor in Maven. And we just hit it off. I can remember we were there for maybe it was a photo shoot or something with the media. And she told me about all of her interest in pregnancy, fertility, women's health. And I can't really remember how we first connected in terms of me helping her edit her first book, Bumpin'. But I don't know. We are two like-minded minds. Unfortunately, she probably shrinks when she sees my text coming through. But honestly, I almost text her every day. I'll see something in the media. I'll want her feedback on something. She's just one of the smartest, most brilliant, most warm, caring, empathetic humans I know. And so I just love bouncing ideas off her. And I feel like maybe she feels the same when it comes to like medical questions and things like that. So number one person, number one fan.
Yeah, incredible. And you were the, what's the proper terminology? The medical editor for both of her books, Bumpin' and Fertility Rules. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. Okay. So obviously I didn't do primary writing, although I would submit paragraphs and then she would edit them. But for the most part, the writing is all hers.
Okay, awesome. And definitely check out those books. Specifically, Fertility Rules, I guess, would be the first step if you're thinking about having a child or not. But of course, we're not here just to talk about Leslie today, although, I'm sure.
Let's have a podcast about Leslie.
I'm sure she'll be thrilled when she hears this. But we want to talk about you. And now you, of course, have incredible expertise. You are a obstetric gynecologist. You are an assistant professor at Rochester University. Did I get that right?
University of Rochester, yeah.
University of Rochester. I'm a Canadian. I mean, what do I know, right?
No,
Living
it's
in
okay.
Germany.
It's okay.
And I'm sure, some of this medical expertise is going to be coming into the picture, but I didn't actually ask you on because you know about all things babies and maternal health. But more specifically, I asked you on because you just have such an interesting both perspective as well as experience where it concerns the intersection of women's health, maternal health, of course, giving birth, having babies, and where it concerns issues like climate change and population growth, overpopulation, if you will, which we'll talk about all the nuances of that in a second. And I got to say, one of the biggest questions that are on women's minds, which I'd actually love you to speak to this as the woman who's dealing with people who are either trying to or getting pregnant, but people are wondering, should I be having a child in today's environment? And you have incredible insights you're going to be sharing on that a little bit more later in the episode. But first of all, I actually want to find out about you as the woman, Jane Vendis. And I would love to know, and I know the answer, of course, but are you a mother yourself? And if so, how did that all come to pass? And I'd love for you to actually share a bit about your kids or child-free decision with us.
Yeah, so I am a mother. I have a 16-year-old boy-girl twins. And so I had them in 2008. I graduated from residency in 2007 at UCLA, and I got pregnant pretty much the month after I graduated from residency. I wasn't always planning on being a doctor. I actually did my college in English. I fancied myself a writer, and I really enjoyed nature and working outside. So I thought I would do landscape architecture as a profession to really support my writing habit. And my thinking around children and having kids, I tell you this backstory because it kind of had its genesis in events in my life leading up to my marriage in 2004 and then the kids in 2008. And that was, I had 2 abortions in college. Both times I was using contraception. I was not in partnerships with people whom I wanted to have kids with or marry, but I can remember specifically the second abortion I had, the OB-GYN who performed it said, basically, Jane, you need to do better, meaning that because my birth control had failed, that I needed to do better. I'm sort of like, no, my birth control should have done better. But I felt that sort of guilt and shame that I know women experience. And then the big event in my life happened in 1995. I had actually left graduate school to marry someone, which was one of the dumbest mistakes of my life. And I was living with him. He said he wanted to support my writing. So that was like, music to my ears. That was the thing I always wanted to do. And I ended up having an ectopic pregnancy. And when I told him I was pregnant, he basically said, the marriage is off. He became abusive. I had to move in with friends. And I went to the emergency room with pain, abdominal pain shooting up to my shoulders, which is a sign that blood is filling in your abdomen and irritating the bottom of your diaphragm. And I had a 3rd-year OB-GYN resident who diagnosed me and took care of me that night and performed my surgery. And I decided in that emergency room that I wanted to become a doctor.
Wow.
I recognized, I had no job. I had no house. I had no bank account of my own. I had no health insurance. I had sadly given away or given up all those things and found myself in the most difficult of circumstances, bleeding to death internally. And I basically looked at this woman and said, I want to be you. And I actually wrote about her when I was a 4th-year medical student. I won an essay contest from the American Medical Women's Association, and she actually flew out where I accepted the award. So we actually reconnected.
I love that. I was going to ask. How cool.
We've stayed in touch ever since. But I tell you all of that to tell you that, when I finally did get married, and I married someone who was not the right person for me. When I finally did get married, my desire to have children was very strong, I think in part because pregnancy and fertility had been an experience of loss. And anger too. The fact that I was pregnant and then kind of abandoned, not kind of, definitely, by my partner financially, emotionally, physically. I felt that fulcrum, that point of inflection that some women are up against when they are in abusive relationships and pregnancy is involved. I think a lot of women recently learned that there are states in the United States where a woman cannot ask for a divorce or become divorced during pregnancy. So very, very patriarchal values placed on a woman's body, stating basically that she loses her autonomy when she's pregnant.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I guess this notion of like you are carrying property of your spouse.
That's right.
Oh,
that's
God.
right.
Okay. All right. So, obviously early, probably traumatic experiences around all these things you experience, both from the judgment of that initial physician to being left by your partner to having this really scary medical experience in ectopic pregnancy, and then turning it into this. It's not, I don't want to call it a later in life path because I'm going to guess you were quite young, but I know having a friend who went through medical school a few years older than perhaps people who are like straight in university, you maybe were you the elder in the class?
Absolutely. I was always the oldest and I was like 30,
Exactly. It was the same for him. That's why I'm laughing. And now it's like he's mid 40s and he's like a very specialized, pediatric oncologist or something. So it's like, it's funny how when we're young, we think we're just way too old, but lesson
That's
in that.
right.
Yeah. If you want to make a career pivot or change, Jane says it's okay. Okay. And so I love, having this like beautiful kind of shift in perspective and looking at the hopefulness of having children and all the beauty there. Was it something that you'd wanted previously? It sounds like, circumstances certainly weren't right earlier, but was it something you dreamed about as a girl or that you always knew you'd become a mom?
No, I can't say that I did. And in fact, I would say the opposite. I would say that I was someone who was really excited about all that the world had to offer in terms of my career, in terms of the arts, in terms of learning and reading and, just the way that I conducted my life in my 20s. I do think that experiencing loss informed my desire to be a mom. And, one of the things that I wrote when I was quoted in the New York Times article that I sent you was that I unfortunately tied the desire to have children with the necessity of having a partner. And I don't, maybe listeners are like, well, duh, of course. But I do think that it is possible to both want to have children and to not either find a partner or not to want to be partnered. Not a lot of people choose that path, but that is the path that in retrospect, I wish I would have chosen because I knew that I was marrying someone that wasn't right for me. But the desire to have children overrode those intuitions.
Yeah. And so to clarify, did you have children with this person or was it after that marriage ended? Yes. Okay. All right. But you're a single mom, as I know you've shared, you've got these two 16-year-olds, which, wow. It must be, do they get along well? Is it a cool relationship they have?
Well, no.
They don't. No, 16-year-old siblings, right? Like...
Well, I've made it easy on them because they don't actually live together anymore. So in 2021, I moved to New York State and my son lives with his dad in California. And that was something that I wanted to do. I wanted to move as soon as I got divorced. But my ex-husband said that, he would use every means necessary to prevent me from moving. Wow. So I had to wait until the state of California allowed me to move and allowed the children to make a decision about where they wanted to live.
Yeah. You're a tough cookie, I'm going to say. You've been through a lot in this lifetime thus far, from what I'm hearing. So I would say, now, how old were you? You were 39. I think you said 40 when you had your kids?
39, yeah.
Okay. And we could say it seemed like maybe not perfect timing in the sense of that relationship that you were in, that marriage, but it was right after you finished residency. But I see a lot of women putting off this decision of having kids until I've finished graduate school. I'm with the right partner. I'm X years old. And so I guess I'm curious to know, I know you shared that you wish, or you would have perhaps had a child sooner. So I'd like to hear about that. And then second to that question, I'm curious what you would say to somebody who's on that fence and like clocks a ticking, so to speak.
Yeah, I don't know that I necessarily wish that I would have had a child sooner. I wish that I would have had a child either as a single parent, because going through a divorce with a narcissist is really, really hard.
Yeah.
And so I wish that I would not have been in a relationship with someone for whom I probably stayed in that relationship knowing that it was going to be deleterious to my health, both emotional, psychological, and that single motherhood was an acceptable path. It's sort of strange because, when I was in training, I saw women pursuing single motherhood, and at the same time, I feel like I put a lot of pressure on myself that if I was going to be a mother, it had to be a 2-parent, traditional family. Yeah. So I wish that I could have relieved myself of those cultural associations or weights, because I think it's actually easier to parent alone than it is to parent with someone who is, abusive or, not good for your health.
Yeah. I've heard that from other women. And I think, first of all, I mean, there's certainly, I think, still a stigma attached to this notion of single motherhood. Specifically, I think probably a single father is a hero. I don't know what your experience has been with that. But I've heard that, yes, perhaps in it, like for many people, they have this vision or this hope that they would be with that perfect partner, and they would have this great relationship that can, they can have and raise children together. But I've heard it's certainly much better to do it on your own than to do it with that wrong person. And because, I mean, you're also really investing with that person, whether or not you stay in a relationship with them when you have children.
Yep. Yeah. It's a pact, and you have to live by the rules.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I guess I suppose the reasons for postponing can be a myriad of reasons, but if somebody's really just like, I'm just not sure yet, I don't know if this is the right thing, like, what would you say a step would be to sort of counterbalance that fertility piece?
Well, I guess, I feel like this question and this answer have changed for me over time. And I do think that, I don't think that my answer would ever be get on with it. I think that, if you're having trepidation about having a child, the commitment is so huge. The one thing that I feel like women around the globe, and American women as well, North American women, don't have is something that, something like informed consent, which is what effect will having children have on me? And I'm a physician, so I'm thinking about the medical side of things. Like, what will the effects of pregnancy be on my body? Yeah. What will the effects of postpartum and childcare be on my body, my finances, my psychological health, my relationships, et cetera, et cetera. This concept was introduced to me by a woman named Jacqueline Fitzgerald, who's on Twitter. She's a urogynecologist, so she takes care of women who have a pelvic floor disorder, so incontinence and prolapse and things like that. And she said, all women should have informed consent for vaginal delivery. And the fact is that we as obstetricians, we don't tell women all the things that can go wrong in both pregnancy and childbirth. And there'd be a lot of people that say we shouldn't, because we're just scaring women, we're medicalizing them, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not quite sure what the right mix of information is, but I can tell you that almost 100% of my patients tell me that they were surprised, unaware, shocked by some of the changes that can happen, some of the effects of pregnancy on their body. And I will say, one of the trends that I'm seeing and that I'm super passionate about talking about is the effects that fossil fuels are having on our pregnancies and our bodies as well. So when I signed out the patient list this morning at the hospital, almost 100% of the 10 women on that list had some form of hypertensive disorder of pregnancy. Now,
Wow.
that's anomalous. It's not usually so high.
Mm.
Unfortunately, the most recent data that we have is somewhere around 15% of all pregnancies are complicated by hypertensive disorder. So this is high blood pressure,
Yeah.
preeclampsia, that sort of thing. But I'm seeing, and my colleagues are seeing
Mm.
marked increases in complications of pregnancy. And I tell my patients that, this isn't your fault. My theory, and I've yet to be proven, although data is coming in small increments. My theory is that we are seeing a saturation of environmental toxins and air toxins that are affecting our bodies, such that otherwise young, healthy women are developing chronic diseases due to exposure to plastics. We saw that study that came out a couple of weeks ago showing 250,000 nanoparticles in 1 liter water. One plastic water bottle. We're seeing phthalates. Phthalates are chemicals put into plastics to make them soft and flexible. There was a study that came out a couple weeks ago showing 1 in 10 preterm births is due to women's exposure to phthalates. Of course, we have the PFAS and PFOS, the forever chemicals as well, that we also know are having profound effects in increasing our risk for hypertension, diabetes, obesity. So one of the things about informed consent is that things are happening in our environment and in our
Yeah.
relationship to our environment that are making us less healthy, and that means we have less healthy pregnancies. And women are really frustrated. They're crying. They're in tears
Yeah.
that they get diagnosed with these things. And so, part of informed consent about the decision to have a child, I think, is, are you okay if some of these things happen? And then the flip side is, what effect will my child have on the environment in terms of population and the environmental crisis, and what kind of suffering might my child see in a world that is facing the environmental and climate crisis that it is. So, it's a flip, like, what effect will my child have, and what will the effect of the world be on my child? So there's a lot of informed consent that I feel like we're not providing.
100%. And I have to say, I think, if we can kind of look at those like those as like 3 core issues as far as, how, pregnancy and the ability to conceive and maternal health and everything is impacted by the environment, the changes in the environment, climate crisis, that of the 3 areas, the latter 2 being how is my child impacted and how will my child impact the environment. That's one that I think most of us are just totally, I don't want to say oblivious to, because I think most of us acknowledge that we know our environment is impacting our health, and we know and we hear, again, many of us, what's in our food, what's in our drinking water, what kind of products are we putting in and on our bodies. I know, at least for me, that's something I'm very cognizant of. But as an example, I have endometriosis, and the question has often been asked is like, is this something that is just there's more awareness, and still shockingly little awareness, but that's a different story. Is there more awareness such that this seems like a very high number, or is there something else going on such that there's such a high incidence of these, quote, disorders? And I'd never considered that some of these things may be the result of what's happening in our environments.
Yeah, well, one thing that we don't know enough about endometriosis here in the U.S., obviously, the funding for women's health research, especially on topics like endometriosis, is abysmal. It's so poor compared, for something. If 1 in 10 men experience that, the funding would be quintuple. But endometriosis fundamentally is, we know, an inflammatory disorder. It releases cytokines, and it sometimes is responsive to prostaglandins. And so the things that I talked about, the plastics, the microplastics, the forever chemicals, and the 10,000 plus chemicals that are in plastics that are unregulated, in addition to phthalates, all of those cause oxidative stress, and they all cause inflammation in the body. We had a study that came out just a couple days ago showing that of 63 placentas that were tested, 100% of them contained microplastics.
I saw that.
So what we're polluting our bodies, and yet we're not accounting for the fact that some of the consequences of that, the downstream, are having profound effects on human lives and the quality of those lives, and conditions like endometriosis. And it's not always the time or the place in triage, which is where I work in the hospital. It's not always the time and the place to say this isn't your fault, but I fundamentally want to say that every time that I encounter a woman with a complication, because most of us have thought about our diet and exercise, which is the two pillars that doctors say: change course or fix the problem if you change diet and exercise. But thousands of women are doing, plant-based diets or whole foods, or they're exercising a lot, and they still are not seeing, the types of changes. I see this especially obviously in patients with thyroid disease. And so I do sometimes tell my patients, you know what? I don't think this is your fault. And stop microwaving your plastic, because that's the number one worst thing you can do is to microwave your food in plastic.
All right. Don't do that, folks. And you can be a real hippie like me. I haven't owned a microwave for about 16 or 17 years.
There you go.
And of course, people say to me, but how do you reheat your food? And friends, it's called the stove or the oven.
It's a stove.
I mean, really, people are puzzled about that. So, okay, everything you share, I mean, super fascinating, obviously very scary. I love that you are, I suppose it's some reassurance to know this may not be a person's fault. And yet I'm sure people listening, those who are on the fence are thinking, cripes, things are even more complicated than I thought they were.
I know. I haven't made it easier.
No, that's okay. So, but now we're going to see how you can make it a little bit easier. I guess my question is, what's a person to do if they're considering even a small possibility that they're going to have kids, or how can they approach this as much as possible in, like, I don't want to say a rational way, but like a calm way? How can they bring a little bit of coherence or cohesiveness to all of these different problems and say, like, right, what do I do with all this information?
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you ask. I feel like this question is bubbling and, undulating through my brain every single day of the year. It's something I'm thinking about. And I just listened to a podcast and read a book by a climate scientist named Kimberly Nichols, my bad.
Oh, yes. I'm hoping to have her on the podcast. I actually messaged her, and I owe her an email. So she would be amazing as a guest, right?
She would be. And she had to we're supposed to cut our carbon emissions in half by 2030. So it's just February of 2024 here. So obviously our emissions went down by like 1.8% last year here in the US. So we're nowhere near 50%, nor will we get there. Yeah. And so I do think that, one thing that she said was fascinating to me, which is that by the time your child, if you were to have them now, reaches 18, we will have used up the carbon budget. So, which is kind of like it's kind of like the climate scientist saying, we will be off the cliff. We'll be in midair by the time your child reaches 18. I'm a scientist, and so I fundamentally feel like, you probably, if you have the ability to look at the science and see where we're headed, then ask yourself, is this an environment that I would want to bring my children into? Because the questions that we ask ourselves are, what does my monthly budget look like? Or my child, might be interested in pursuing drama or this sport, and how do I plan my life around that schedule, et cetera. But I think that, what I see a lot of people saying, what a lot of scientists saying is, will there be enough food to eat? Mm-hmm. And that, I think, if you're thinking about having a child, it won't be the concerns that modern parents have right now. I think as the climate warms and as food crops fail, we are going to see supply chain issues, like we saw with COVID, but 10 times worse. And depending on where you are, there might be a question about, will you have enough food? Not can you afford it, but even will there be food? So I spend all day, I spend way too many hours, Kelty, looking at this data. And I'm telling you, it doesn't look good. So my advice would be make sure that you're ready for some shocks like that if you want to have children.
Hey, we are back for season 2, which means it's time for another one of your reviews. Have you left a review yet for the Kids Are Child-Free podcast? If not, what the heck you waiting for? So many of you left wonderful, kind, glowing reviews after listening to our episodes in season 1. And today I want to read one of those reviews to help inspire you to share something wonderful with us over on Apple Podcasts. This one comes from Sarah Eliza B. via Apple Podcasts in Great Britain. She says, insightful and unbiased. 5 out of 5 stars. Feeling compelled to give a written review as I am 31, single, and have been looking for honest and open conversation on the kids or child-free decision. This is it. Those around me are starting to settle and have kids, so it is comforting to know that I am not alone in questioning this path. I appreciate all the different angles considered and the host, Kelty, who actively listens and asks insightful questions. Thank you so much for this. Thank you so much, Sarah Eliza B., for sharing such wonderful, kind words with us about the podcast. I'm thrilled that you are loving it. I am so eternally thankful for all the wonderful support and feedback you have been giving, all of you. If you've not already left a review, please head over to Apple Podcasts. I will link to that in the show notes. Share some kind words with us. Give us a 5-star review. This will help fellow clarity seekers who are trying to discover if kids or child-free is for them. It's going to give them a chance to discover us and tune into the podcast. Thank you very much. Maybe one of your reviews will be read out in an upcoming episode. You never know. You could soon be Kids or Child-Free podcast famous. And who doesn't want that? I think, myself included, we want to have the answer presented to us like tied up with a bow or on a platter, so to speak, of like, it's okay for you to do this, ethically it's all right, or you don't need to worry, your kids are going to be okay. And the fact is, we don't entirely know. We do know a lot of things for sure, like, to a degree, we're totally fucked. And yet I think, I can't be the one to, nor can you, to say this is the right or wrong thing to do. There's going to be, and I do think, it's a philosophical question of asking, like, what makes a life worth living? And does,
right.
what is a good quality of life? And of course, I'm sure you see this question for people who are doing, let's say, testing during pregnancy to say, like, what's the likelihood that my child would have a potential, illness or disorder or ailment, what have you, disease. I'm not using the right terminology, but we understand, I think, what I'm referring to. That's going to be unique for each individual to say, like, that's something that I'd be okay with. It's something I feel would be right or not right. I did read something interesting you shared, and it sounds like this could be maybe an interesting resource for people. I believe her last name is Ray, W-R-A-Y.
Britt Ray, yeah.
Britt Ray, yeah. She's written a book, which I'll make sure to link to that one as well as Kimberly Nichols' book in the show notes. But and I can't remember the name of her book. Perhaps you can. Do you remember Britt's book?
Generation Dread.
Generation Dread says it perfectly, and she also would be, I'm sure, an incredible guest. But and I just want to tie it into the context of what we're talking about now, which is she went through this period of trying to decide to have kids, but really just in a state of essential panic around how terrible things were looking. And ultimately, her and her husband did decide to have. I think they have one child now. Perhaps there's others, but in the article I read, they have one child. And interesting conversations came up in some of the people she was speaking with, specifically from, for example, the Black community, people who've been historically oppressed, specifically, many places, but let's say in the USA, that they were kind of like, yeah, hello, the world is a scary, unsafe place, and it has been for many people for a long time. And so for someone like myself, as a upper middle class white woman who perhaps hasn't seen much strife in her life, one could say, it can feel immensely scary, which isn't to say it's not scary for people who have had to deal with, discrimination, oppression, starvation, war, what have you. But I do think we can maybe look to some other groups of people and communities to say that there's a resilience there of like life can be bad and it can still warrant having children. And that's, again, that's
right.
not up to me or you to decide. I feel like I just like verbal vomited on you. What do you think of all this?
Yeah, I do. I put together a list for myself the other day of the reasons to have children. And, one of them was because your people have experienced, genocide or to your point, profound and immoral oppression. And, when I got to that number on the list, I was like, well, yeah. I mean, I don't have a counter argument for that. And yes, children are a sense of hope when your people have experienced, just enormous cultural, societal, financial, economic harm. And I do think that is a fascinating, inflection point to talk about, which is the child as hope. Now, as you might know, I'm also taking this class in about pronatalism and how pronatalism affects our viewpoints around children. And, something that I've learned about that tension when it comes to pronatalism is how to center ideas about reproductive justice for every woman in that conversation. Because is the question after, is the child a point of hope or a reason to hope? The next question might be, whose hope? And is it that individual's hope? Are we centering the person that will bear the pregnancy and suffer the consequences of any complications thereof?
Yeah.
Or are we centering other people's ideas about who children are and what they mean to a community? And so I think dismantling parts of the patriarchy and parts of religion and the government and capitalism and corporations, because all of those other interests have also had an interest in whether or not a child needs to be born. And so when I ask that question of myself, I go back to my reproductive justice roots, and I started a medical students for choice chapter at the University of South Dakota, and it was awful, the things that happened to me for speaking out about reproductive justice.
Wow.
In that setting. And I've published papers on abortion care. And anyway, obviously the United States is wrestling with that topic, has been profoundly so, especially since Roe v. Wade overturned. But having said that, I think that sometimes when we talk about children, we don't center the woman and we don't put reproductive justice at the forefront. I think if we do, then we can give good advice and we can help people make good decisions so long as they are the center and not maybe some of these other entities that have an interest in whether or not she has a child.
Yeah. And it's, you're speaking about this, centering the woman. Obviously, we can think about like extreme instances in which we would like to, or maybe aren't, but should be doing so. But I think we can even look in like, let's say, okay, here in Germany, perhaps some of these issues may not seem so much at the forefront, although I think we still need to be really concerned and keeping a watchful eye out, especially with the rise of the far right, as we're seeing here in many other countries. But even thinking about like, okay, if I am not sure about having a child and the pressures from, what society wants, what my mother wants. And I think it's so hard to put the emphasis back on, not just for the physical well-being, but the mental, the emotional, the well-being of the person who's birthing or raising this child, I think is immensely important. I want to talk a little bit more. First of all, this notion of pronatalism, I don't think it's something we've properly defined in any of our episodes. And I've heard different sort of, now I'm putting you on the spot, but can you actually, for people who are listening who are like, pro what is pronatalism? And then I want to delve into this a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, pronatalism is basically the way in which society, and by society, I mean all those entities I talked about before, government, religion, those people, to your point, external to you, might have a view about whether or not any given woman should bear a child. And so pronatalism is an ideology, right? It's the idea that in order to have a strong religious following, you need more followers.
Yeah.
In capitalism, it's the idea that in order for us to have a GDP that keeps growing, we need more consumers. And so it fundamentally is like a rivulet or a source of water that kind of flows quietly underneath a lot of aspects of our society, unnamed. But it's also the idea that having children is the default, right? And that not having children is somehow aberrant. And it's interesting. I've been reading this book, Eve, which is this one woman's attempt to understand how the female body influenced evolution over the last 200 million years. It is such a fascinating read.
Wow.
And I just finished the chapter where she was talking about other animals in the kingdom of animals, where not every animal in that species reproduces, or I can't remember what animal it was, but an animal can be pregnant and then interrupt her pregnancy if she encounters environmental potential for harm, right?
Yeah.
Or other species that can basically cause a miscarriage when they are in harm's way. So this idea that everyone gets pregnant and everyone reproduces is not normal in the animal kingdom, and I don't think it should be the norm in the human kingdom either. But it is, and we need to push back on some of those ideas, because I do think that they do harm not only to the environment, of course, but also to individuals who choose to be childless or who would love to have children but can't.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think it's an immense concern for people to think about going against the grain, so to speak. Of course, we want to be accepted. We want to be, in with the flow, most of us. Let's talk a little bit more about people without kids, because we've talked a lot about this prospect of getting pregnant and what it's like for women who are giving birth. Yeah. And of course, that's your specialty, but
that's what I do.
That's what you do. But I also know that I think you even said you gave a presentation on this recently relating to like population, overpopulation, and pronatalism. And so I'm interested to get your take on something. And that is, can you confirm that a couple things are true? One is the world population is still increasing, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
80 million a year.
Wow. Okay. And so that I think, we're aware we resources are at beyond capacity. We're beyond the tipping point. At the same time, all I keep hearing and seeing are headlines saying, fertility is dropping, not as far as women's ability to conceive, but actually births, the birth rate is declining. Women are having less kids. Of course, us child-free people have been much villainized in many, popular news outlets, if you will. What are your thoughts on that? And like, how would you respond as a child-free person, essentially, if the blame is being leveled on you for population decline?
Yeah. Well, to me, when I hear someone say that, I think, well, then you have the wrong economic system.
100%. Yeah.
If your economic system requires you to continue to consume, like right now, we're consuming 1.75 Earths, and that's why we are in overshoot, and that's why there will be some kind of collapse, is because you can't continue to consume land, water, resources, minerals, etc., and continue to grow. But I want to point your listeners to a fascinating article that I saw last night from the BBC. And it was looking at South Korea, because South Korea actually has one of the lowest fertility rates. I think they're at 0.55. And the women who were interviewed for the article were saying that they don't want to have children, in part because of patriarchy.
Yeah.
They don't want to bring up children into the patriarchy, but they also, have worked really hard their lives for their careers. And what they see is that that patriarchy makes it such that they lose ground in their careers. They might not feel as fulfilled as mothers as the culture or those around them expect them to, and basically that their quality of life diminishes. And so it was interesting to read that South Korea has spent $2.36 billion trying to convince women in South Korea to have babies. And so, my answer to the question is, if people want to be child free and the economic system collapses, again, that's the wrong economic system. And also it's the wrong cultural system where women aren't valued and, where their labor caring for children is demeaned and diminished. And, until and unless we create a system that allows human flourishing for both men and women, why are men and governments surprised that women don't want to have children in this environment?
Yeah. No, I think you nailed it. I mean, in my mind, governments, if you will, the powers that be, they're asking the wrong question. They're saying, well, why aren't people having kids? Let's have, we need to encourage people to have more kids. And I think, the question is, why are people not having children? Like it's the system itself that has contributed to that in many ways. Of course, there are some women who just simply don't want it, but the number of people who say, I'm not going to be adequately supported. I'm going to have to pay $2,000 a month for daycare. It's just shocking. So, and don't worry, Jane, I don't pay too much mind to people who make comments like that. Actually, when somebody asked me that, I said, just to clarify, and he was a smart gentleman I heard speaking at an event, I said, is the implication that it's my responsibility, my civic duty to have kids? And he said, oh, well, no, I'm not saying that. I'm like, yeah, you better not be.
Well, and you mean, as you pointed out, probably, I don't know, I can't speak for Germany, but what we're seeing here in the United States is that the far right is doubling down on the subordination of women, is doubling down on our role as incubators for capitalism. And so obviously what we saw a couple weeks ago, making embryos, a full person, obviously overturning Roe v. Wade, politically, I think this will continue. And I hate it when people bring up The Handmaid's Tale, but my God, the idea that reproduction isn't going to be something that becomes a bigger topic of concern for governments around the world, I think is because this is a math problem, Kelty, right? This is, if the capitalists see that this aspect of, whether it's they say, there won't be enough taxpayers to fund Social Security, or there won't be enough people to provide workers in manufacturing or whatever the case is, the people who have been making all that money and the top 10%, the top 1%, I think they're going to go to a lot of means necessary to try and fill those workers for the production of their wealth.
Yeah, I don't want to go down like a totally even more apocalyptic future, but like, do you think, is it at all reasonable to think that at some point women may be mandated to have children? Like, I would say, no, that's crazy talk, but like,
I think certain politicians here in the US absolutely would love to see something like that. I'm just imagining like all these women who like escape one of the red states in the United States to go get healthcare, like vigilantes, because, obviously in some cases that happened this last summer that were profiled in the popular press where, they were like, they could die if they don't get the healthcare they need in a state other than the one they're living in.
Yeah. Oh man. Okay. And oh man, I mean it. These damn men.
Yeah. I know. I'm sorry.
No.
I'll never be invited to a podcast ever again.
That's okay. I'm sure I'll get some messages after this one saying I've lost all hope. I've made my decision. Okay. So, aside from the question of should I have kids or not, I just want to touch just briefly before we wrap up sort of this segment. And then I'd like to go back to you and motherhood before we tie off today's discussion. What can we as women who are concerned about, our own reproductive rights and choices, because really this question, do I want to have kids or not, is an immense privilege. And it's one that many women in this world do not have and are at risk of being taken away. So what can I do to help protect my choices and the choices of other women in this world?
Well, I think obviously to protect your own choices is to vote and to understand, which candidates are going to pass laws, because these laws are coming hard and fast. And, I feel like having worked in reproductive rights for, I think my first march was when I was 18 and I'm 55. So I feel like I've spent the majority, well, not the majority, I've spent my almost entire life thinking about how to defend bodily autonomy for women, how to encourage politicians to make policies that are not coercive and force women into subjugation of others' values. So I would say voting, obviously, and we've seen great success with that here in the United States when referendums are put to the voters as to whether or not abortion should be a fundamental right for women in that state. Voters overwhelmingly, 65%. Are voting in favor of allowing women bodily autonomy. But we can't obviously sit out any election. Having said that, I do think that we can say that the right to have a child and the right not to have a child should be a fundamental human right, no matter where a woman lives. And so obviously that could mean donating to causes that, help women. What we know is that women in other countries, in the global South especially, are at a strange intersection, right? Where due to the climate crisis, researchers know that the fewer children a woman has, the less ecological impact. Now, I accept that science. Having said that, what we also know is that the biggest ecological impacts, of course, come from the global north. The person who would have like the biggest global impact might be if Travis and Taylor had a baby, right? Because of her
for that kid, yeah.
I mean, I think that woman we saw, the tracker thing was like over 900 tons of carbon from her jet alone.
It's like a country somewhere, yeah.
Yeah, or maybe it was 9,000. I think it was 9,000.
It's all a lot.
Anyway, the bottom line is that, I fundamentally feel like before we start giving advice to women in other countries, that we obviously need to address our own country and our own consumption, because our consumption in the global north is affecting the lives and the ability of people to feed themselves and have the families that they want in countries, that are not emitting 1/100th of what we in the global north might emit. So I do think the calculus has changed due to the climate crisis, and that, we probably shouldn't be giving that much advice to others outside of our own country.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with that. And, at the end of the day, for those of you listening, if you've not made this decision, it's a privilege. It should be, it is a right that we should all have. But choose wisely, as I know you're doing, know at the end of the day, this is your decision, your body. I hear a lot of stories from women who are, receiving immense pressure, specifically from partners, to have kids. And at the end of the day, this needs to be something that you also want and can feel good about, and that you feel like you have the right sort of resources to support. So, and not just for yourself, but also for the future child or children. But I want to ask, what do you love best about being a mom?
I guess the thing that I love best is creating experiences and sharing experiences with my kids. So, that could be, exciting things like a trip to a national park. But it could also be some sort of discovery in the backyard, or, sharing one of my favorite books with them. So cooking, I think just, getting to have conversations around, small but not insignificant moments in life.
Yeah, very cool. What's one of your favorite books you've liked sharing with your kids?
Well, my kids are 16 now. So, they've just started reading books that ask deep philosophical questions, which is my favorite type of book. So, 1984, for instance.
Yeah. A classic. Awesome. Okay. And, I don't want to end on a low note. We won't end on this note, but what are a couple of the biggest challenges that motherhood has brought you?
I feel like the biggest challenge was navigating a deleterious marriage, and trying to be a good mother in the face of that potential harm. I will say, that the moment that I decided that I probably needed to divorce was when I was crying on the bed, and my daughter came up to me and said, "Mommy, what's wrong?" And I kind of knew if I didn't make a change that I would demonstrate to her that the way that I was being treated in that marriage was how she should be treated. And that's when I knew I had to do something.
Super powerful. Thank you, Jane, for sharing that. And your daughter's a lucky woman.
Thank you.
Okay. If there is somebody who is considering going down the path of single motherhood, going into this saying, I'm going to do this on my own, what is one thing that person should either consider or ask themselves, would you say?
Well, the thing that has the reason that I've been able to be successful, I believe, as a single mom is because of the community that I created. And it was interesting. Your last interviewee talked a lot about the lack of support and not going into childbearing unless you're sure that you have support. And I would say yes. And I think that you can create incredible communities with other people. They can be parents themselves. They can be childless. They can be male. They could be female. And, I've actually had a huge community through Facebook. A lot of female physicians are on Facebook. And so we created communities, and then, we would support each other in writing, in responding to each other. But then we would meet up too, and we'd go on vacations together. And as our kids went through different challenges in their lives, and as we did as well, we had each other. And I know that I, would not have been successful. Sometimes I feel like I wouldn't have survived as a single mother without my fellow single physician mother friends. And so that was my community. But then I've also had, great neighbors and people to rely on for childcare and things like that. So I actually think you can build a community.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that's a really important reframing, because I think sometimes people think, oh, well, for example, like in a case like me, well, I'm living on the other side of the world for my family, and or I don't have a great relationship, or I lost my parents, or whatever it may be. And so they think, I'm not going to have that support. I'm not going to have that community. But of course, that's something we can build and nurture. And great to have some sort of support network, I think, in place before embarking on this journey. But it comes alongside it as well. It's not like it's necessarily has to be one and then the other. And online groups are another great example. I think sometimes we think by merit of the fact that, like, well, I live in a city where that's not really the done thing. How am I going to meet other single moms? Or, I'm part of a religious community or what have you. Like, you have the world at your fingertips, and those relationships, I think, can be every bit as meaningful and impactful as the ones that we can make with people we're sitting face to face across from.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay. So before we wrap up the infamous 5 rapid fire questions, the first couple are answer this or finish the sentence. So being a mom is
challenging.
Being a mom is not
insurmountable.
I'm wondering one thing that you think would make this decision easier for women who are on the fence. And I'm thinking a little bit more like either societally or culturally speaking, like what's something that might make this less difficult for people to decide?
Wow. Kelsey, I feel like that's the toughest question in the whole wide world right now. I mean, I feel like the way people approach problems is different for every individual. I know how I would approach it if I were that person right now. And I would read like 15 books. But I don't know that that's the advice that is the right advice for everyone. I think it is helpful for podcasts like this, where you talk to a wide range of people and you get to hear lots of different experiences and kind of do these great deep dives where you're able to elicit journeys and feelings and perspectives from different people. So I'm actually really thankful that you're having this conversation because I feel like the questions that you ask on this podcast are actually the most helpful.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying so. And I feel like, I've gotten such beautiful feedback from listeners, and I'm also like, oh, it's me. I'm the one who gets to have the conversations. It's really quite fortunate. And I get to ask the questions that I want the answers to, although
That's right.
although I've made this decision, like I'm just a naturally curious person. I love learning about people. And I think there's so much we're discussing here that like really gets forgotten or either glazed over day to day. So thank you for saying so, Jane. What is one thing that you would like women who are child free to know?
That I'm jealous because I think you have more time to read all the books.
I do read a lot. True. Okay. And lastly, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would that piece of advice be?
I feel like it's the same answer that I've heard a lot of your guests offer, which is to trust your gut and to trust your intuition. As we talked about in this podcast, there's lots of external influences on whether or not to have a child. And I do fundamentally feel that you're the only person that can make that decision for yourself. I have to say, I was not aware until maybe a year and a half ago of a Facebook group called I Regret Having Children. And I feel like that's not something that we talk about. We only, if we regret having children, we really don't mention that in public spaces. And yet when I read through some of those posts, I feel like, if someone is on the fence, it might be helpful to understand if people did have children and regretted it, why, and for what reasons, and what did that journey look like? And I actually hope that can, be normalized. It doesn't mean that you don't love your children or like your children, or, that you have ill will towards them, but just with any choice in life, we can regret it. And so I think it might be helpful to bring some of those voices forward for people that are trying to decide.
Well, if anyone listening regrets their choice of having kids, and again, it's, people conflate this with, well, it means you don't love your kids or you're a bad parent. On the contrary, the evidence suggests that actually some people who regret having kids are like incredible parents. There's an overcompensation effect.
They're overcompensating.
Yeah. And so that Facebook group is great. There's also a subreddit. I think it's Regretting Parenthood. And I want to shout out a book written by, and there's been very little research done in this area, but Orna Donath, I'm probably pronouncing her name incorrectly. She's in Israel. I'll share the link to her book in the show notes. It's called Regretting Motherhood. And it's, as far as I know, the key or main study that was done, I think on a group of about 28 different women who identify with this. So yeah, I agree. I think getting different perspectives, talking to as many different people, but being selective about, it's not about asking people, what do you think I should do? It's really about getting the information that you need to make a well-informed choice.
You can hear her. She podcasted with the professor of my pronatalism class on their podcast called Overpopulation Balance. And so I actually just listened to her speak like a week and a half ago, and it's profound, some of the things that her study showed. And to your point, I feel like listeners would benefit from hearing some of that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's a topic we definitely need to delve into, and there's so many different aspects of this. So the podcast episodes will keep coming. I'm already recording awesome season 2, which you will be on. Jane, I would like to thank you for coming on. And before you go, first of all, if people would like to connect with you, either, they want to know more about something they heard here, or maybe they're interested in having you speak for, I understand maybe you can tell a little bit more about what sort of opportunities you would be interested in partaking in.
Yeah. So people can follow me on Twitter at Jane Vandis, all one word, JaneVandis. And my Instagram, I keep private, as do my Facebook. I'm obviously also on LinkedIn, as you mentioned before. But my favorite thing to speak on right now is the intersection of maternal health and the climate crisis. And I approach that from a side that most people don't, which is I talk about the way that the climate crisis is affecting our bodies from the outside, which is like heat and air pollution and the things that we commonly think about when we think about climate change. But then obviously 10% of all global oil is made into plastics. And that is the that is the plan for Big Oil, is to move more and more of their business into plastics. So they have no plans to limit polluting the insides of our bodies as well. And so I love to talk about how some of the chemicals that I mentioned in this podcast are affecting maternal health and fetal health as well. But as I get, I've actually it just occurred to me, Kelty, the other day that I might need to write a book. I've never thought I would write a book, but I might need to write a book about the incorporation of some of the things that I've been learning in this pronatalism class, combined with my passion for the climate, combined with my background as an obstetrician, and kind of put that all together. I don't know. Maybe. We'll see.
I'm smirking here, which people won't be able to hear on the audio. And the reason is because when they say like, it's like everybody else knew before you, I feel like this is one of those things because I'm thinking all you've talked about through this episode, aside from all the wonderful wisdom you've instilled in us, is like writing the book, writing. I love reading. I love writing. And I'm thinking like, as far as I'm aware, you haven't written a book, but why haven't you written a book? So yeah, you most certainly need to write that book, and I will definitely read it, and then we'll have you back on the podcast to talk about it.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
You heard it here first. Today's the day, February 28th. The book is going to happen.
I'm going to go text Leslie.
You say, Kelty made me do it. I'm going to write a book too. I'm going to say it here. I haven't started yet, but there are shockingly few books that have been written on this topic and decision. There's a couple of real good ones out there. There's been very few published even in the last few years. And so there's going to be a unique perspective and maybe a bit of a how-to guide for how people can help through all gleaning my wisdom and the coaching work I do. Nothing's working. If you're listening, you're a publisher or an agent, you want to represent me, hit me up. Hit Jane up too. We can do a 2 for 1.
I love it.
Okay.
2 for 1.
2 for. Thank you so much, Jane, for coming in. Wish you a beautiful rest of your day, and we'll speak with you soon.
Thank you so much, Kelty. I love your podcast. Thank you for doing this work.
Thanks for tuning in for this latest episode of the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Now, before you go, I have a little something to share with you, and that is I want you to go check out the free resources page at kidsorchildfree.com because I have some goodies on there for you, guides you can download. I've got a recording of a class that you can check out, different tools, exercises, resources to help support you to make the kids or child-free decision that's right for you. I will link to that in today's show notes. And again, you can also find that at kidsorchildfree.com. That's all from me. I wish you a beautiful rest of your day, and I will see you back here very soon.